So hopefully, you listened to the video yesterday of the dark side, really, of the home front, the war at home, and there's a lot of racism, there's a lot of hatred, and remember, we see this, guys. We see this when there are crises and when there are panic situations where people want to lash out and try to find a scapegoat and try to find somebody to blame. We see really, really extreme versions of that, like what happened in Hitler under the Nazi rule to the Jewish people within those countries, and we even see it in America. You saw that there was discrimination against Mexican Americans. There was discrimination even against African Americans for the war effort. But the biggest example was the Japanese Americans. This is probably one of the dark spots on our soul in our American history. Really awful stuff. And it's important to point that out. Again, why do we always point out what we point out? To prevent it from happening again, so we can learn from it, so we can grow. Information is power. So we're going to explore this treatment of the Japanese a little bit more detail today. Even though she did have a powerful story, she wasn't the only one who suffered. So I want to give you the big picture on that. So basically, what's happening in the beginning of the war, right? We declare war on December 8th, 1941. We don't do very well in the beginning of that war because we're not prepared. We haven't been making weapons. We haven't been preparing for this. Our fleet was wiped out. It's not until really midway, right, where we start to get on a little bit of an offense. But before that, we were on the defense, and we were losing. And so between Pearl Harbor and between the Japanese in the beginning of the war, basically taking over everything that they tried, we had only known defeat until Midway, and that was hard. Okay, between like Midway and the Battle of the Coral Sea, that was hard for Americans, and hate grew, blame grew, and they directed that hate and that blame onto Japanese Americans. And we can see that they were very, very, very much discriminated against in this country. And again, it's lashing out because of hate. And I often get asked the question in class, well, why Japanese Americans? Why weren't German Americans? Why weren't Italian Americans? We were at war with them too. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there were less numbers. It's kind of hard for us to think of it this way because we live on the East Coast. This was the West Coast. That's where Japanese Americans primarily resided. Obviously, there's exceptions to that, but there were a lot more on the West Coast where they did get attacked, where if, again, Japan would have beat us at Midway, the west side of our country would have been under more threat. And Germans and Italians at this point had assimilated into the country more, and just physically it's harder to pick them out. And so we really see that Japanese Americans get the brunt of this. And when I say there was discrimination, there was discrimination. And it's really sad because most of these people are Americans. Most of these people were born in America, never been to Japan, didn't know Japanese. Okay, some of them are second generation Americans, and they are upset and heartbroken and totally distraught after Pearl Harbor. I read this soldier, a story about a Japanese American trying to sign up for the army, and they literally told him no, right? And so his story, as I'll read it to you, he says, I tried to enlist in the U.S. Navy with 3 of my Caucasian classmates. They were accepted, but I was not. I said, why not? I'm an American. But they said I was an enemy alien and I was no longer an American citizen. I really felt like being rejected. I really felt like being rejected by my own country. Now, he later is able to join, but it's not until 1943 where these Japanese Americans, who, again, wanted to protect their country, are accepted into this war, and that's only after years of such harsh discrimination. I mean, you're talking about boycotts. You're talking about people in the streets. I mean, look at these. These are children. Like, what were their parents doing? Letting children get out with signs calling Japanese Americans. You can see that it says Japs up there. That's not This is a negative term, especially for that time. And then they called them rats. And that one poster that I showed you last week about the Japanese discrimination, we saw that there too. And so we're seeing a fever of hatred, very similar to the beginnings. Let me make that perfectly clear. It's the beginnings of discrimination in Germany against Jewish people. You saw the same thing. You saw rallies. You saw little kids in the street protesting. You saw mass boycotts of Jewish businesses. And we're going to see the same thing here. And so by the time that the Japanese Americans are allowed to serve in the army, they're only about 30,000 that they would let in. And they were all in segregated units. So now we're going to talk about how the worst point in discrimination against the Japanese. And I just kind of want to point what this is right now. Now, if you're looking at this, you're probably thinking, well, that kind of looks like a prison camp. Some of you, if we were in class, might even say, if you had already had prior knowledge about the Holocaust camps, you might say that kind of looks like a camp to me, like a Holocaust camp. Unfortunately, it is not. Okay, they are not. There were 10 of these camps across the United States, and this is where many Japanese Americans were ripped from their homes, ripped from their lives. Okay, civil liberties violated all over the place. And they were forced under lock and key, okay, barbed wire fence, snipers, guard towers, okay, they were imprisoned in these camps after doing nothing wrong. And that's what these camps look like, and we're going to get into more detail about that. So basically, how did this happen? So President Roosevelt issued something called Executive Order 9066. And this allowed basically the U.S. military, okay, to round up Americans that they deemed dangerous in name of national security or like a national emergency. They were allowed to round up anybody without charges, without evidence, without any accusations, and they were allowed to move them into internment camps. And that's what this is. This is a Japanese internment camp in America. And this was something that Roosevelt had ordered. Congress ended up upholding his executive order. Executive order is just when the Congress has an order for that time. It doesn't necessarily go into a different precedence, and it doesn't have to go through Congress. But it doesn't matter because Congress end up voting for this anyway. Okay, they end up upholding it. And then later, it's unbelievable, but so does the Supreme Court. Now, Japanese internment, let's get into some more detail. We see about 110 to 120,000 Japanese Americans, again, are forced to leave their homes and live in one of these. And you can see this. When I say prison camps, I mean, this is what they were. Okay, here in the United States, we imprisoned American citizens without any crimes, any due process, any trial, any evidence. And about 70% of all of these people in the camps were actual American citizens. They just weren't, legal Japanese immigrants, okay? They were actual American citizens. And we see that the last of these camps actually didn't close until after the war was over. The war ends in 1945. And like I said, this all gets upheld by all three branches of government, which just makes it even more unbelievable. Now, living conditions, they lived in overcrowded barracks in the middle of a desert, okay? And so like in the desert, it gets very, very hot during the day and then very, very cold at night. Some of these didn't have heat, okay? They didn't have heat in many of these. Many of these, they had no running water and everybody shared bathrooms. And so the diseases, the bad hygiene is unbelievable. Again, in America, where everybody's supposed to have rights and you're not supposed to have cruel and unusual punishment. And these weren't even prisoners, okay? They were forced against their will by their own government that they served. Now, later, they did let people leave the camps, but it was only for war purposes. And here's kind of like the baffling thing, is that originally they wanted to just put these camps inside of Hawaii. That was the original intent. But then the business owners, the farmers, really, the sugar farmers in Hawaii, threw up such a stink about it because they're like, hey, this is how we use Japanese immigrants to, mind our sugar fields. We need them. Like, you can't do that. And so they don't even put these in Hawaii, okay, which is closer to Japan, right? They put these in California in mainland the United States, in actual states in the United States, because Hawaii at the time wasn't a state. And it's just like what was the point of this? You're not going to do this in Hawaii, which again would not have been necessary to begin with, but you're going to do it in California? That makes zero sense. And so let's take a look at some of these conditions. So clearly you can see these are overcrowded conditions. I mean, not fit for human capacity. Again, you could look at this one. I mean, just all of these people in a camp that doesn't have adequate sanitary conditions, not to mention all the kids that weren't going to school, lost their freedom. And there are stories of people who tried to leave the camps and they were actually shot. They were killed. American citizens were shot for trying to exercise their freedoms. This one too, you can see that, they're trying to make it look like a home, but obviously they're sharing this. Again, no child should be raised in one of these. And honestly, does this not give you the sense of kind of like a prison mentality here? Okay. And again, do you see any bathroom facilities? They all shared one bathroom. And again, there's no running water. Obviously, there's no heat in any of these. Now, Congress later on, and I know President Reagan actually worked with Congress to do this. So this is during President Reagan's era. President Reagan in Congress in 1988 formally apologized, okay, to each of their survivors and gave them $20,000 to the survivors in 1988. So, 40 years later, let's give you $20,000. Now, why is that kind of why do I have an issue with that? Because it wasn't just the time that these people lived in the camp, and you're going to see a video here that kind of shows you that. These people lost everything. They lost their businesses. They lost their homes. Even after the camps were closed and they let the people come back, they came back to nothing. A lot of these people had successful businesses. A lot of these people had farms. A lot of these people had homes, and they were sold out from underneath them to different Americans, and these people got nothing for it. Their businesses were closed and they got no compensation for it. Their farms were actually burned in many cases, and they had no compensation for it. So $20,000 40 years later is not going to make up for the economic disaster that these people were forced to go through. So $20,000, I mean, in 1988, that's not even a year's salary. And some of these people lost lifetimes of businesses. And so that's kind of why I want to play you this. Now, this is a video from the History Channel, and it's going to go into more detail about it. It is a little bit longer. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but we're going to watch about 10 minutes of it. And I'm going to stop it here and there to kind of point things out now. You're going to have a couple of questions throughout the video, not much. But I have two running questions that I want to make sure that you're adding to as you're looking at this video, okay? And they're going to be two running questions, meaning that you're not just going to answer them once and move on. So as you watch this, I want you to describe, I want you to list all the different ways the Japanese Americans' rights were violated. And that includes before what happened, okay, before them losing their property, losing their homes without due process, without any compensation, all the way to the decision that the Supreme Court makes and how backwards that is. And then the other running question I want you to do is describe the living conditions and the hardships that these people went through. So you're going to be talking about the basically how their constitutional rights are violated throughout the entire video, and then also the living conditions. And then I have a couple more questions that should be pretty easy for you to point out.
FDR was in his third term as president when the war began. He had guided the nation through the Great Depression. No president was ever more powerful. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066. 9066 put the Secretary of War and his commanders in charge of deciding where the military zones would be and who should be removed. It gave the military power over the Attorney General to make these decisions without any hearings or due process. This was unprecedented power for a president, even for FDR. He asked Congress to support Executive Order 9066, and it did.
Congress followed that with Public Law 503, which then gave it power.
The laws did not specifically name any race or ethnic group, but allowed the military to impose restrictions on anyone it deemed a threat. But everyone knew who would be targeted. Military areas were created, and at first, curfews and other restrictions were imposed on everyone of Japanese descent.
Okay, I want to make sure you get what the video just said. Here in America, we are run by a system of rule and law, right? And there are three branches of government where we have rights. That eliminated, this one order eliminated that for basically one entire group of Americans. And they put the military in charge of figuring out who was a threat. And they literally stripped the Attorney General the power to protect and enforce constitutional rights for just an entire group of people. And again, we don't live through a military dictatorship. That's not what we have. It's specifically stated in the Constitution that that's not the kind of government that we should have. And so clearly, right on its value, this should have been taken away. And this is what I've been telling you guys all year. Like, there's a lot of good that comes out of things, and then there's a lot of bad. And so, like, just like we talked about with President Wilson, like he was forward thinking. He wanted to stop colonization. He wanted to increase democracy throughout the world. But we talked about he was complete racist. Okay. Same thing here. Look how much FDR did for the American people. Okay. Again, like forward thinking, protecting people, helping them out of the Great Depression, getting us through World War II. But yet he supported and enacted this obviously clearly evil order. Okay. And so there's a lot of times with a lot of good, there's still some evil.
When the evacuation began on March 22nd, 1942, newsreels announced its start with a tone wavering between fear and contempt. This one, called Out They Go, never mentions that 2/3 of the evacuees were American citizens, but refers to them by a word we'd never use today.
Japs evacuate vital West Coast areas for the national security. At Los Angeles, 36,000 Japs see the handwriting on the wall and sell out their goods before their voluntary departure.
The evacuation wasn't voluntary, it was the law. And before it even began came mayhem, theft, and loss. People were only allowed to take to the camps what they could carry on their backs. They had to make arrangements to store or get rid of everything else they owned on short notice. The lucky ones got 2 weeks, some only a few days.
Most Japanese Americans had to leave their properties behind. There's lots of incidents when, they were cheated or they weren't given full value for their property. There were a lot of fire sales that happened, so they had tremendous losses.
A congressional report 40 years later detailed some of the loss. One proprietor had to sell her 26-room hotel for only $500. Refrigerators were extorted for $5 or less. One man poured gasoline on his house, determined to burn it down rather than leave it behind. His wife stopped him, saying, "We are civilized people, not savages."
Empty streets and vacated stores stand in shadow. And in the country, the same story, abandoned farms.
All they had left were suitcases, sheets, and blankets. 120,000 people, babies, and the elderly. They were searched, some were even tagged. No one knew if they were going to be deported or how long they would be in prison because there were no trials, no hearings, and there was no due process to inform them.
They didn't know what the intention of their government was toward them, and they didn't know what the future held.
The evacuation took almost 18 months. 8,000 actually moved east to parts of the country outside of the military areas to avoid internment. The whole thing took place in stages. First, evacuees were taken by buses, cattle trucks, and trains to nearby assembly centers where they would be checked in for a few weeks before being shipped out to to the more permanent internment camps.
And so this is where it's kind of important to pay attention to the details. And again, I don't want to compare the two. I don't want to compare what happened here in America to what happened necessarily in Germany, because they were different. In Germany, you're going to see death camps. That's different. But we often think of internment camps. We just automatically associate them with the Holocaust, okay, with what Germany did. And that's not the case. Like, we've talked about that. We talked about when we talked about the Spanish-American War, that when you have camps where you put civilians who have not been accused, nor have they had any charges brought against them, those are internment camps. And that's not just something that was associated with the Nazis, but just like there and here too, you're going to see it comes in steps. Okay, so at first, they said there was just boycotts, and then there was just there was curfews, and then they start moving them to one camp, but they have a little bit more freedom, and then eventually they're going to get into the main camps.
Assembly centers were oftentimes temporary shelters in fairgrounds and sometimes in horse racing tracks. The conditions were exceedingly rough. Horse stalls that were hastily cleaned up of the manure and the smell and so forth.
The first thing we had to do was to make our own mattresses.
Norman Mineta was born in San Jose, California. He grew up to be a congressman and the first Asian American to serve in the cabinet. He served under both President Clinton and President Bush.
The idea that their own government thought them to be disloyal. This was a yoke of shame that was borne by the Japanese American population from that time on.
This is what we would do to show this country the extent of our loyalty.
John Tateshi was born in South Central Los Angeles.
We'll give up everything. We'll sacrifice everything we own and all of our futures and go quietly into these camps. It was astounding.
People were confined in camps at some point from May of 1942 to as late as 1946. But at first, many camps weren't even ready. Sewage systems, schools, winter insulation, all had to be built by the very people who were being forced to live there. So
these concentration camps, because that's what they are. We associate that term with just the Nazis, but anytime we have camps like this, they're called concentration camps because you're concentrating people in the camps. Were built by the people that were going to be in prison there.
Were in the desert where sandstorms were common. Others were built on swamps and overrun by mosquitoes.
All of the camps they built were in isolated spots.
10 of them scattered throughout the American West and a couple in Arkansas.
Hart Mountain, Poston, and Tule Lake were the largest. Tule Lake also housed those whose loyalty the government specifically questioned. The War Relocation Authority, or WRA, called them relocation centers.
I remember when they would say, well, you're being interned for your own protection. Well, as a 10, 11-year-old kid, I knew that if I were in here for my own protection, why are the machine guns pointing in at us and not out?
We heard this young man shouting and saying, as I recall, something about they couldn't keep him there, that he was an American. And he started walking out, and the guard, who was probably about 15 feet from him, just shot him in the stomach.
So I wanted to make sure you guys heard that because I thought it was pretty powerful. I thought it was extremely powerful about, again, they're American citizens and they're being kept there. And they're being kept there for their own protection, though, right? But you're not really protecting me, you're killing me off. And so I'm going to fast forward this to when it gets brought to the Supreme Court.
October 11th and 12th, 1944. Korematsu's attorneys argued that Executive Order 9066 was a violation of the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection because only citizens of Japanese ancestry were being forced to report to the assembly centers. And the fact that they were detained without a hearing or a trial was a violation of their Fifth Amendment right of due process, protecting them against the federal government. Solicitor General Charles Fahey argued the case for the United States that in time of war, the government, and especially the president as commander-in-chief, could do what was necessary for the nation's security, even discriminate on the basis of race.
You have to remember, at the time of Korematsu, Brown versus Board of Education hasn't yet been decided. Segregation is still the law of the land.
The Supreme Court handed down one of its most controversial decisions on December 18, 1944.
The Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that President Roosevelt's order was constitutional.
The court said that this is time of war, and in time of war, it is necessary to do things that might not be permissible in time of peace.
Justice Hugo Black, who later became known as one of the court's great champions of civil liberties and equal rights, wrote the majority decision that accepted the government's argument of military necessity.
Okay, so what the video is going to go over now is basically the ruling of the Supreme Court. And again, this is the flaws that is in our system. And if we were going over civil rights later on in the year, you would see that. You have to remember the people in the Supreme Court, they're people, right? They're fearful. They're at war. And so you do see this very grave mistake made by an institution that we often look up to as not having mistakes, being above fear, being above politics. And this is one of the few times that the Supreme Court does not do what it's supposed to do. And so they're going to talk about how they write what's called a majority ruling. And so the majority ruling is out of the 9 Supreme Courts justice. The majority of the justices agree with this. They write out their decision. They write out why they have their decision. And their basis of facts. Now, only three of the Supreme Court justices are not going to agree with the majority rule. And when that happens, those Supreme Court justices have the option of writing a dissent, okay? And so you did see that 3 Supreme Court justices were able to be forward-thinking, see past the fear, see past the politics. And they wrote a very scathing dissent, basically blasting the federal government and their other colleagues, the other justices, for what they called an open racist decision. And I think it was one of the first times that the word racism was ever used in a dissent. But even with that, this decision held strong. We don't see that, the camps don't totally end until after the war, well after the war is over. And then at that point, it's not like they just said, okay, I'm out of the camps. I'm going to go home and pick up the business that I had or get the job that I had or go back to the house that maybe I had already paid off, to the car that I had. No, they're literally stopping. They're literally starting over from scratch in poverty. And we've talked about that throughout the year, how hard it is to get up from that economic position. So that's about it.